Mr. Byrd, my first question is for you. Mr. Byrd, I'm someone who supports technological innovation. If we're able to make workplaces safer, if we create new jobs in the process, I think there's just tremendous opportunity there. But I would also agree with the statements that you made in your opening testimony that we have to tread carefully with the rise of automation, which is happening now and will continue to happen in the future. I would categorize automation as perhaps one of our biggest opportunities as well as one of our biggest challenges for our country and the world in this next century. And we certainly have our work cut out to ensure that technology continues to be a force for good and that everybody benefits from technological advances and innovation, not just a few. And that probably really depends on enacting the right policies today. You can't wait, particularly as technology is moving as rapidly as it is now. We have to have those policies today so that these advances have real benefits for workers and for the American middle class, not in the future, but now. So my question for you, Mr. Byrd, is when it comes to the freight industry, if we can harness technology in ways that vastly improve safety, also expand job opportunities, if we can do that to help our country, is that something that we should be striving for? And would you support that type of innovation within our country?
Thank you very much for your question, Senator. Yes, we could support that type of innovation, but we have to make sure that, as you indicated, on the front side, we have to make the necessary investment to ensure that there's regulatory authority established, and we understand which agency or agencies are going to have that regulatory authority. We have to keep in mind what has to be done for the training of the workforce to ensure that they can adequately operate the new vehicles or be retrained to provide maintenance or other support functions for those automated vehicles. So I think if we take a step back and take a comprehensive look at all of the elements that are necessary to move forward, I think we could do this in a way that would not be necessarily harmful to the existing workforce, and it could help move forward in terms of us being able to innovate as a country.
Well, that's good to hear, and we probably have to do it simultaneously. You mentioned stepping back, but technology is moving rapidly. From a competitive standpoint, we're facing international pressures from significant competitors. The Chinese are investing billions of dollars into this technology. Europeans, that if we do it simultaneously, and we're thinking about both equally, that sounds like something you would support and your organization would support.
Yes, and I also think that it's important that we understand as a country what companies are moving forward with the innovation. Where is this happening? We need to have information about the challenges that these companies have encountered in terms of implementing these types of technologies, the type of malfunctions, the other types of problems that they may have encountered. And then we need to get input from the workforce that's actually interacting with this technology to get their input to understand how this is having an impact on workers also.
Right, thank you. Mr. Baker, in 2017, a notorious railroad crossing in Plymouth, Michigan was blocked for 9 hours. Unfortunately, blocked railroad crossings are not something unique to Plymouth. That's a problem that happens in towns all across my state, all across the country, as you're fully aware. Unnecessary delays hurt local businesses, making it harder for them to operate, and hurts families trying to get their kids to school and to activities. Makes it difficult for them to get to and from work. And worst of all, it can be an enormous public safety problem. Blocked railroad crossings can prevent first responders from attending to life or death situations and many other safety concerns. And that's why I'm currently working with Ranking Member Fisher to address this problem. Chair Cantwell and Senator Blunt are also working on this issue with legislation that they put forward. So my question to you, Mr. Baker, is do you support my efforts and Senator Fisher's efforts and the efforts of many other members of this committee to address delays at rail crossings to improve safety at these crossings. And could you comment on how your members are addressing this incredibly important issue?
Yes, sir. I'll try to answer each of those questions. On the addressing it first, the short line railroads are extraordinarily committed to addressing those individually in real time with communities. Frankly, it's probably a little bit easier for short lines than some of my class 1 friends, given that we typically have smaller track and or shorter track and simpler networks to manage, and we generally can address those problems, and we work very hard to mitigate any of those impacts before you would ever hear about them. However, there obviously are still challenges, and we're not perfect, and sometimes they're unavoidable. We're very supportive of Senator Cantwell and Blunt's proposal to fund grade crossing elimination, and we've endorsed that publicly, and we think that in times where we can't solve the problem operationally, throwing some money at the problem, frankly, to help separate the crossings would address the issue. And with the Fisher, Tester, Moran, Klobuchar, Peters bill S700, I believe we've said publicly we don't oppose the bill. Frankly, I would say we find it a much more thoughtful approach than your friends in the House took in H.R. 2 last year, and if that bill finds its way into surface transportation authorization, we do think that it would be beneficial to gather some of that data, and it would be a useful, productive step.
Great, good to hear that. Mr. Spear, just to follow up to that, I mentioned some of the challenges when you have railroad crossings blocked, but certainly that means problems for the trucking industry as well. Could you just briefly tell the committee what would happen when you have Plymouth, for example, with a 9-hour delay, what that could mean for the freight industry, for your industry? What sort of challenges does that present, and why do we need to fix this problem?
Yeah, I think it really underscores the intermodal, nature of our supply chain now, and it has repercussions. It certainly backs up the movement of freight. We've seen it there. We've seen it in, blockage of the Suez Canal, as was mentioned earlier. These things are very measurable. We have to look at each one individually, as they're all a little bit different. This latest cyber attack of the Colonial Pipeline, certainly something that we are working hand in glove with DOT to ensure that, not only is it back up, but we get that fuel to where it needs to go. We don't want long lines. We want to make certain we maintain supply. But when you talk about resiliency, it's these instances, they have a compounding effect on our ability to get freight on time. It not only delays, but it escalates what we pay. And it's also an issue of safety, particularly when you have hours of service suspensions and working that, already depleted workforce harder. So these are all things that you have to look at panoramically and really understand the complexity of supply chain. How resilient really is it? One of these instances we're pretty darn good at managing, even a natural disaster to a global pandemic. But when you compound all those at the same time, there's a break point. And that's what I think the next bill really needs to look at is, in totality, the whole supply chain, and equip government with its private sector partners in a way that we can manage those instances effectively. So you're spot on right in looking at these problems, because added up, they're going to be a real significant impact on the economy.
Mr. Connor, my next question is for you. The Great Lakes navigation system is essential to freight mobility in the United States, and there's no question our Great Lakes ports support countless jobs all across the country. I want to talk about one particular piece of critical infrastructure, and that's the Soo locks, which are really the linchpin for the whole system. They're located in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and they connect Lake Superior to Lake Huron. And roughly 80 million tons of cargo pass through the locks each year. Most of that is iron ore produced in the United States. That starts up in Minnesota and travels down to Michigan and steel mills all along the Great Lakes, and an essential link in the supply chain for domestic steel production and manufacturing that relies on steel, certainly the auto industry in particular. But there's a major problem that only one lock in the Soo Locks complex, the Poe Lock, is big enough to handle large cargo vessels. And as a result, the Poe Lock handles roughly 89% of the total tonnage that transits the Soo Locks. And if the Poe Lock fails, it would be devastating to the whole economy. In fact, a 2015 report from the Department of Homeland Security estimated that an unanticipated closure of the Poe Lock would trigger a national recession and would cost upwards of 11 million jobs in the United States. That's why I've fought, along with my colleagues in my delegation, to fund construction of another large lock in that complex that will create the redundancy, mitigate the threat. But we also need to make other infrastructure improvements in the locks. In fact, as I toured the locks with the Corps of Engineers, some of the pumps that pump the water were made back in the early 1900s. That's certainly a testament to how good the Army Corps of Engineers is in keeping things running. But we shouldn't have pumps that are from the early 1900s for a critical piece of infrastructure that could have a devastating impact should it fail. So my question to you, Mr. Connor, is specifically related to that. You've addressed it with the congestion at the ports, but talk to me how important it is to make sure in any infrastructure package we're funding projects like the Soo Locks and other pieces of infrastructure that may not be a port but are an integral link to the mobility system.
Yeah, absolutely. And Senator, you said it so well yourself. You know, the inland waterways are essential movers of goods to coastal ports and to the global marketplace, to and from the global marketplace. And specific to the Soo Locks project, in our $6 billion Army Corps of Engineer ask that I articulated earlier, we're seeking completion funds so that the Soo Locks project can be completed and no longer be a bottleneck for trade. But there are so many essential pieces of the integrated intermodal network from coast to coast that facilitates trade between nations that need to be addressed in this infrastructure package. I think now is the moment to make the commitment to get the spending in place and to prepare this country for not only the next generation, but maybe the next 2 generations, if not 3 generations, so that we can compete in the world economy.
Well, you're absolutely right, Mr. Connor. And another issue that I'd love to have you address here too, and you talked about that with previous questions related to ports and the crowding that we have, particularly on the east and the west coast, and the needs for significant infrastructure investments. But as you're well aware, we have a lot of smaller ports across this country, and in the Great Lakes, for example, the number of smaller ports where investments, considerably less in terms of dollar amount, investments in those ports could yield huge returns in terms of capacity, and to bring some of that freight up the St. Lawrence Seaway and into the heartland, and then to connect with rail and trucking and other assets. What is your sense of the necessity for us to make sure that we're funding infrastructure improvement projects in smaller ports located across our country, but in particular those in the Great Lakes that historically have always been a major center of commerce?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I would cite what I said to Senator Baldwin earlier. You need only to look at the PIDP process over the last couple of years, and the subscription for that program was in excess of $1 billion each year. So it by 4-fold exceeded the amount of the appropriation to get a sense of the need from ports of all sizes, including many of the smaller to mid-sized ports that you're referring to, including those in the Great Lakes, who are seeking to improve their port infrastructure so that they can be more efficient and more competitive in the global marketplace. So it's a huge priority and something we're a big fan of. PIDP. We'd be an even bigger fan if we could see that dollar appropriation get significantly higher.
And one final point related to that point. In your testimony, you discussed the challenges that ports have due to CBP screening requirements and resources. Clearly, the Department of Homeland Security and CBP have a really tough job. They have to do 2 very important things. One, they have to keep us safe, first and foremost. And second, they need to move trade as efficiently as possible across the border. But sometimes smaller ports, smaller facilities have challenges getting the the security personnel, the CB personnel necessary to facilitate that trade. In your mind, how can we best balance security concerns and evolving threats with port operations to move freight more efficiently? What should we be thinking about doing?
Yeah, what I mentioned in my opening remarks is, some type of a funding mechanism for CBP so that they can create the kind of infrastructure they need at ports to best do their job. In the absence of that, the trend that we've seen and has become a growing concern for our members is a shifting of the cost burden for facility upgrades and for officer shortfalls away from CBP onto the shoulders of the ports. This has gotten very problematic in that it at times comes with concerns over if the ports don't pony up, that the speed in which cargo is screened will slow down, further compounding the whole freight movement issue we've been discussing here this afternoon. So I think it's incredibly important that we address this, we bring it out into the open, and we find a permanent solution to make sure that CBP has the funds that they can operate true to their original mission.
All right, thank you. Mr. Spear, in my final question here as we wrap up the hearing today, I want to talk a little bit about international ports of entry. And in Michigan, we have two of the busiest ports of entry in North America. In fact, of the top 5 in terms of the volume of cargo that goes across an international border, 2 of them are in Michigan, Port Huron, Sarnia, and Windsor, Detroit. And certainly any kind of infrastructure package requires us to make sure that we're moving that freight more efficiently. And right now, the construction of the Gordie Howe International Bridge is underway to alleviate some of the traffic that is on the current bridge. In fact, you can see trucks just lined up as they try to come across that very, very busy border. So my question to you is, how will investments to enhance capacity at these ports of entry, how is that going to improve your ability of your industry to move cargo and freight in a resilient and timely fashion? And why is it something that should be a priority for us?
Well, I think partnerships are something that I would emphasize, especially when you're looking at crossing borders. You mentioned a significant crossing. I've been to Laredo as well. I've seen 11 to 14,000 a day going across that. It's staggering to watch the dance unfold, and that dance involves a lot of partners. And when you look at the private sector industry, we have a vested stake to move that freight quickly, but safely and securely. And we take that very seriously. The partnerships that we have with DHS, but beyond CBP, we've got FMCSA looking at the safety of that equipment, making certain that those crossing in that aren't U.S. plated are doing it according to the law. These are all rules of the game that we have to play very well. And those that do have very strong understanding of the relationships that we have with our federal law enforcement agencies. So I think we build on those partnerships. I think it builds trust. Creating programs that really underscore efficiency is extraordinarily important. You then toss in good infrastructure and alleviating those choke points, you'll be able to see those partnerships really take advantage of the throughput and also not compromise safety and security. So the infrastructure is important. I also think good trade policy and good tax law is important. You do all those things at the same time, I think you're really coming up with a good recipe. So something that we really underscore, we really want to partner and really have good transparency with our law enforcement partners. We do, and going forward, I think insert any policies, we would look for that to be a leading part of the bill.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Spear. And